Hi there, and welcome to Where's the Money Gone, the podcast that takes you inside the football boardroom with me, Adrian Goldberg. I'm a West Bromwich Albion season ticket holder, investigative journalist, and author of Where's the Money Gone, the battle for the soul of English football, which is available now via Byline Books. Joined as usual by Charlie Methvin. Charlie is managing director of Mount Pleasant FC in Jamaica, a shareholder of RAEC Mons in Belgium. He was formerly a director of both Sunderland and Charlton Athletic, as well as being a boyhood Oxford United fan. This time I want to talk about German football fan culture. I'm recording this episode in Dusseldorf after seeing a couple of games this weekend. VfL Bochum against Dynamo Dresden and Cologne against Leipzig. I want to talk about how German fan culture differs from that in England. Plus, Birmingham City's new stadium and their Moneybags owner Tom Wagner. And the Premier League agrees new spending rules. Squad cost ratio replaces profit and sustainability. Charlie, welcome. I'll talk to you in detail about my German football experiences, whether you like it or not, in a moment or two. But what's your footballing weekend been like?
My Belgian football experience last night was a very happy one. We've been through as I think I've said on previous pods, we've been through an injury crisis the last 3 or 4 weeks, and it's really interesting to see how a head coach copes in these circumstances, particularly one who's new to the role. And I have to say, George Boateng has managed his way through it extremely well. Last night we were playing against Charleroi under 23s, because in the Belgian league, the top flight under 23 teams get to play in the second and third division. And they've been the best under 23 team in our division this year. But we played exceptionally well. Exceptionally well, given a still somewhat makeshift team, but the players are gradually coming back from injury, and that is a reassuring sight. So we remain level top of the league with our big rivals, 2Bs, with 3 matches, I think, left until the mid-season break. So it's cold, as I imagine it probably is in Dusseldorf, but it's certainly very, very cold here. But despite my somewhat bleary eyes, I'm feeling warm inside, and that's what football can do for you, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I've had that warm feeling twice over this weekend. So I'm staying in Dusseldorf, which is a great centre to travel around the north of Germany, which is absolutely littered with football teams. So many clubs in this area. I've travelled through Leverkusen on the way to Cologne. I was down in Frankfurt earlier in the week talking about my book, and just everywhere you go, there is football. It is every bit as football crazy as the UK. So I've been to see Bochum, VfL Bochum, and they lost at home to Dynamo Dresden. That match, if you were a member of Bochum, and I managed to get a member's ticket on the black market just by offering €20 to a guy outside. But if you are a member of Bochum, admission to that game, standing up behind the goal, not what we would call safe standing either, but traditional terracing, that costs €14.50. And then I saw a Bundesliga game, Cologne against Eintracht, cracking game. That was 4-3 to the visitors. Now, that was a ticket that was on general sale. Anybody could buy one of those tickets. As it turned out, lots of Eintracht Frankfurt fans did, even though it was in the Cologne end, and there was a real mixture of home and away fans. No lack of passion, not a hint of violence, I have to say, inside the stadium. And that cost €35. So in total, those two tickets were €50, about 45 quid. That was the price I was being asked to pay for a second tier game at the weekend at West Brom away at Coventry. So I saw a second division game in Germany and a Bundesliga game for the same price as one championship level match in England. Now, it's not all about the money, but I think that does speak of an attitude in Germany, a respect for supporters, a desire to get the stadiums full and bouncing. Both of the grounds that I attended were full. They were both bouncing. Coventry against WBA, which I followed on the TV, had loads of empty seats. So, although there was a decent attendance there, 29,000, I think that was tickets sold rather than the number of people who turned up. And just a few other observations as well, Charlie. At kick-off, and this is common in every German game I've been to, there's usually a club hymn, maybe a couple of songs, but always at least one song and everybody joins in. So it's not just like the notional singing stands behind the goal, the traditional ends. Everybody in all four stands of the ground joins in, twirls their scarves above their head. And I think there's a kind of, in English football, maybe historically it reflects the kind of class divisions between certain stands. But in Germany,
Yeah,
although there are price differences, everybody joins in that part. And just a final observation before you come in, much of the noise and the colour, certainly behind the goals, was choreographed, and it was kind of happening almost regardless of the action on the pitch.
yeah,
Certainly at Bochum, and this I saw this from the Frankfurt fans. There's a guy down the front with a megaphone, and about
yeah.
80% of the noise was unrelated to the match itself, but noise there was, huge noise. About only 20% or less of the noise directly related to the game. I'd say in England, 90% of the noise relates directly to the game, what's happening on the pitch. So I'm not saying one is better than the other, but it is a noticeable difference. And just one final thing as well, you could have beer in the stands, both on the terraces and at the seats in Bochum and at Cologne. People were drinking beer openly. People were walking around selling you beer. But despite that, it wasn't an oppressive, laddish atmosphere. There were loads of women in the stands, both in the terracing and in the seated areas, and older people, younger people, and it just kind of felt a happier place than an English football ground.
Well, what a fascinating rundown. And I know you go and watch German football regularly, and I'm due to do so again soon, and I'm really looking forward to it. I'm going to go to Dortmund, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Jealous.
So there's just so much in there, isn't there? We almost need two or three pod episodes to investigate the differences between Germany and England. What is the case is that it's in Germany and England where attendances are booming, right? So I saw some graphs this week, which are really interesting. Um, where to start? Well, the first thing is to say that English football attendances in the Premier League and the Football League are at their highest now since the 1950s. Been gradually rising over the last 20 years, and they're now at the highest since the 1950s, which is all the heyday of football as a working class sport. And I think what you see is a drop off in the late 60s going into the 70s and the 80s with football hooliganism and with stadiums dilapidating for lack of investment, etc. And we remember those from our youth. Um, Going through to the first of all Hillsborough and the Taylor Report, and then into the birth of the Premier League, whatever we might think about that, making it effectively football acceptable to the middle classes and to women. And effectively, the growth over the last 25 years has been from those two demographies. In other words, it's not that a whole bunch of working class people used to go, then didn't go, then all did go again. What's happened is we've seen a change in the makeup of English football crowds to more affluent. I mean, obviously, there is still a very substantial working class component, but that you do now get the more affluent people coming as well and wanting a slightly different type of experience. And the percentage of females in the crowd has been steadily on the rise for the last 20 years. Now, so how does that break down in terms of across Europe attendances? Well, effectively, other major football geographies are somewhat in decline other than England and Germany. So the most attended league in Europe last season was the Premier League. What do you think was the second most attended league?
I know this because you sent me the graphic through. Was it the championship?
The Championship. The
Yeah.
Championship was the second highest attended league last season. Now, that is a gross number. And of course, there are more English Championship games than there are Bundesliga games. And if you did it on a attendance per game basis, Bundesliga would be second to the Premier League. And not by much, by the way. It's not a huge amount in it. But it's nonetheless interesting that, given what you said about there being empty seats in the Coventry game, that the Championship is now, even on a per game basis, has higher attendances than Liga in France, and it's not far off Serie A in Italy. So football's booming in both countries. I think in Germany, and I make this observation with a little bit of knowledge, having a German wife. You alluded to it being a less class-ridden country. They have historically had and still do have a very small upper class who all sing hunting songs and sort of go on expensive skiing holidays to Ischgl and these types of places. But below that, what we call the Von class, the sort of the younger class. Below that, really, everybody is pretty much of a muchness, depending on how well you do at school and what kind of job you go on and get. Of course, you earn more money or less money, but basically, you are below that, you are German. And further than that, you are from the region or the province, which you're where you come from, because it was obviously historically lots of different duchies and kingdoms which are melded together into Germany. So you don't have quite the same level of class consciousness that you have in England, and then that is reflected, as you quite correctly said, in the way in England you have the louder, cheaper seats behind the goal, and then you have the posher people in the seats down the side, particularly if they're in the second tier, whatever it might be, and the noise is quite different depending on where you are in the stadium. In Germany, it's not like that. It's a very different thing. It might be a younger person who goes behind the goal and a more middle-aged person who doesn't, or whatever it might be. So I think, yeah, really, really interesting observations, Adrian. And I think the point you make about pricing is interesting, right? Because we have to remind listeners that German clubs are mostly fan controlled. Now, if I was to say, as somebody running a football club, to any fan base, what would be your priority? They were sort of cheaper tickets. Absolutely that. And the problem in England, where we have this culture of clubs being owned by the mill owner or the shipyard owner or whatever it might be, is the expectation is that those cheaper tickets will be effectively compensated for by the owner putting money in himself. Whereas in Germany, where the clubs are fan owned, of course, they understand that there is a connection between how cheap the tickets are and how much money can be spent on the first team, and they're willing to make that compensation, because every time that any kind of wealth, kind of private ownership comes near a German football club, there are fan protests, big problems, and all this type of stuff, because they absolutely treasure their idea of football being this communal coming together, as you say, singing songs together, being together. And it's not owned by one person, it's owned by all of them. And they'd rather have that than they would in what I always regard as a more vulgar way in which English football fans here get your checkbook out, spend more money and all this type of stuff. You don't get that in Germany, right? Because they know it's their club, right? So it's their checkbook. And that, in a way, just makes for a much more healthy, more focused on what I think the important things about football are, which is about a community coming together. It is about meeting up with people and being exposed to members of your community who otherwise you wouldn't meet, and all these different types of things that really, really are the things that matter about football. German fans have squared up the fact that if you want all of that, you probably aren't going to be the ones that spend lots and lots of money. And I think, just to conclude on my sort of, because I think both of us love German football. If only they didn't have just one dominant club, it would be the perfect football ecosystem.
Well, I agree on that. And I think Bayern Munich's continued success, is it 12 years out of 13 now they've won the
Yeah.
Bundesliga, does stand as a kind of rebuke to the German football model. But so much else is positive about it. And I should stress when I say this, Charlie, it's not said with any slight towards English football. I love English football. I love going to the baggies, but I do think it is enlightening sometimes to compare experiences and say, well, look, there are things about this experience that we could maybe transplant into English football, and there are things about it that maybe you wouldn't want to have. But just a kind of general orderliness behind the stands. I stood behind the goal, as I say, this was not safe standing at Bochum. This was traditional terracing. People were drinking alcohol, and it was absolutely rammed. But I managed to find a place on the terraces, as you always did, and wedged myself in somewhere.
Wonderful.
People were
Wonderful.
incredibly friendly. And one thing I would observe is that the demographic, as I say, there were all sorts of ages there, but there were certainly lots of young people, both young men and young women, sometimes as couples, sometimes young women on their own. So this idea that if you've got terracing, that it somehow is off-putting. Well, it is off-putting when it's terracing like it was in the 1980s and when fan behaviour involved shoving people down the steps when you scored a goal and creating a surge. But in Germany today, there was nothing negative about it. It was really good, and I can't wait to return. Let's get closer to home then, Charlie. Let's talk about Birmingham City because they've caused some waves. They've got plans for a new 62,000 capacity stadium, bearing in mind that St Andrews, their current ground, holds about 27,000. They've got wealthy American owners. Tom Wagner, the NFL star Tom Brady, is involved as well. And they've got the backing of Stephen Knight, the creator of Peaky Blinders, who's had a hand in the development of what they're calling the Powerhouse Stadium. There's going to be brick, kind of massive chimneys coming out all around the ground. Some people have compared it to the front cover of the Animals album by Pink Floyd. Some people have compared it to Lord of the Rings, but there are quite a few jokey memes going around about it. But I tell you what, it is a real sign of ambition for Birmingham City, who, let's remember, are in the second tier, but desperately want to be in the top tier.
It's a sign of vast, vast ambition. And I can't quite work out in my head whether it's a good idea. I was speaking as a football investment person. I can't quite work out in my head whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. Okay, so let me put the case for why it's a good idea first. As we've just said in the segment about German football, English football attendances are on the rise. And they're on the rise pretty fast. I mean, we're seeing clubs reach attendance levels which they haven't for a long time. I was looking the other day at the numbers of Preston North End, for instance, which obviously was a historic club of the old days when the Northwest ruled English football. Now there are loads, well, there always have been loads and loads of clubs up there, and perhaps that part of the country has benefited less than other parts of the country from the middle classization of football because it doesn't have such a strong middle class up there and there isn't as much affluence around. But, you know, nonetheless, Preston has been in the Championship for the last 10 years or so. But I saw just that they've been achieving their highest average attendances since the 1950s themselves. They're getting up close to 20,000 average attendance at Deepdale these days. You know, for a club which has always been regarded as one of the smallest in the Championship. And you've got an absolute plethora. You don't have any super clubs in the Championship this year in terms of like sort of Sunderland and Leeds and Villa have been in recent years. But nonetheless, you've got a plethora of clubs who are all averaging around about 30,000. And many of them are, if not sold out, then often sold out, often at capacity. So you have to then ask yourself the question as a football exec, well, if we had an unlimited capacity, how many could we fit in on those days, right? How many would turn up on a really busy day? And I think the answer with, you know, clubs like Coventry and Birmingham is on a good day at the moment, they could get 35, 36,000 on occasions. They're locking enough out. Maybe even if you were doing a little bit better, maybe this would apply to the Baggies as well. On a really good day against a sort of local opponent, that you could probably get 35,000, that type of thing. So these stadiums that were constructed in the aftermath of the Taylor Report are starting to look like they might not be big enough. And the reason why this is so important is that there's a general feeling in football that we're nearing the end of the media rights boom. Right. So even in English football, which is the biggest TV rights market in world football, you're seeing a leveling off of TV contracts. Right. So for the Premier League to get the deal that they've currently got with Sky, they had to put more games into it. So effectively, they're receiving less money per match than they were previously. In European football, the French have lost their TV deal entirely and now have to broadcast direct to market. And they're now receiving about half of what the Championship gets for its matches. And this is because basically the model of multi-sport TV packages paid for on a per month subscription basis are becoming less popular. Why? Because younger generations, as they move up into the core demographies, are not wanting to pay monthly subscriptions for sports, right? And that then means that those broadcasters have got less revenue, which means they have to be more picky about which rights they bid for, and even then they have to be very tight on how much they pay for them. Otherwise they find themselves effectively underwater. So effectively what's happening is what you saw in the music industry, where all this happened 20, 25 years ago. I know the music industry is very dear to your heart, Adrian.
Mm.
And once digitization really sort of came massively into the music industry, and the the old model of bands making money through selling albums through their record labels and this stuff started to become much more problematic, got a lot of piracy and all this type of stuff. What happened? Well, what happened was is that touring became more important and live attendance became more important. And this is how people are seeing football. When I say people, industry insiders are seeing football over the next 20 to 30 years is increasing in attendance at the same time as you get decreasing broadcast revenues. So if I was to be optimistic about Birmingham, I'd say they are seeing 20 to 30 years into the future. They're building themselves a stadium, which will mean they'll never be tapped out in terms of how much they can fit in. And that in a moment in time, in 10 years from now, when TV rights deals are becoming smaller, that they, with a massive new stadium, with various other revenue streams built in around the area, it's going to be called the Sporting Quarter of Birmingham, will mean that they then have the types of revenues which enable them to compete at the top table when some other clubs who have been perhaps a bit unambitious about their stadiums, knowing they're going to get a certain amount of money from TV rights every year, then get caught out. Right. That's the case for it. The case against it is that in football, you always have to think, as a football business person, you have to think about the total amount you're investing versus the total amount that your entity might end up being worth, right? Now, I reckon that Birmingham's owners, which is a company called Knighthead Capital, and you're right in saying that it's money bags, but the money is not actually Tom Wagner's himself. He is the guy who runs Knighthead Capital. Now, doubtless, he has a lot of his own money tied up in that, so it's not just other people's money. But fundamentally, he is playing with other people's money, right? Mostly. They've got about 15 billion assets under management, and the majority of that money, the clear majority of that money, is from other investors, right? Faceless investors who put their money into Knighthead, and Knighthead invests it in stocks and shares, in bonds, in all other stuff, and also in this, right? As it happens. So effectively, he's got a lot of other people's money to spend, but he also has to try and make sure that those other people get a return on their money at some point, which will mean that at some point, Birmingham needs to be sold, right? Because it's not a wealthy private individual hanging on to it into his, sort of latter years so that he can take his grandkids and that type of stuff. This is somebody who actually has a mandate to try and make money on behalf of others. So at the moment, I reckon that Birmingham's owners, Knighthead, are around 110 to 120 million quid into their football journey. They bought Birmingham for about 40 3 years ago. If you remember, they had a bumpy start. They appointed Wayne Rooney and they got relegated. Then they came straight back up again. But that's 3 years in, right, to their ownership. And they are, I would say, about 110 to 120 million quid in. If they were to try to sell the club right now on the open market, playing in St Andrews, as things currently stand, etc., their value would be about 70 million. So as things currently stand, they're 50 million quid behind the 8 ball. However, if Birmingham get promoted, and if Birmingham move into their new stadium, and if they are able to fill that new stadium, we'll come on to that in a moment, in the Premier League, you're looking at a 500 million quid valuation, 600 million quid valuation. You're in sort of Everton type sort of territory, that kind of, that kind of club. So effectively what they're doing is they're preparing for success. They're preparing for the fact that they are going to be one of those clubs that becomes really successful, and making sure that once they are, they aren't then constrained, like, say, Bournemouth are currently, by, oh, crap, we've got a small stadium. Well, what are we going to do about it? Match day revenues aren't enabling us to compete, etc. We have to sell our best players because otherwise we don't have any money, and all this type of stuff. So then the question comes, well, are they going to fill their stadium? Right? Because it's a vast amount of money that they're going to have to spend on it. I mean, absolutely vast amount of money they're going to have to spend on it. So you need to think that you're going to get a return on that investment, because St Andrews holds 30,000 and 27,500, and it's not full every week. It's almost full. It's almost full, but it is not fully sold out every single week. And therefore, you would have to say that there's not currently the obvious pent-up demand that means at the moment you open the new stadium, it's just going to be full straight away. And you know better than anybody that this is a competitive football market. They've got a club with Champions League football just a few miles up the road, there they've got Wolves and the Baggies who have their own historic support bases. They've even got Walsall that mops up 10,000 a week, etc. So there is a lot of choice, and as we know in football, it's all bound into family histories and which part of town you come from and what your style is and all this type of stuff. So it's not like you're in one of these situations where it's a single club city and you say, right, okay, if we get this right, then there is definitely the audience here. It's a city of about 1 million people, is it?
Well, a bit bigger than that. If you take, well, Birmingham itself is 1 million, and if you take the West Midlands conurbation as a whole, you in excess of 2 million. Can I just interrupt, Charlie, and say a couple of relevant points here? I think are that this isn't just Knighthead's money. They are being very astute in
Yeah.
leveraging public money. So Rachel Reeves has announced a £2.5 billion fund for Birmingham, and a lot of that will go into public transport infrastructure. So clearly, if you're going to build a 60,000 odd capacity stadium in a site that is currently a derelict brickworks. It used to be a thing called Birmingham Wheels in part, which is a kind of go-karting track. It's a kind of pretty run-down part of town. You're going to need the public transport infrastructure, but they managed to leverage public money in order to do that, or at least the promise of public money. So I think they've been quite clever in that regard, and they've managed to get a bit of a political head of steam. And that's where I think people like Stephen Knight, who I mentioned, the creator of Peaky Blinders, brings a level of cultural capital to the club, which I kind of think can open doors that money sometimes can't. And my final thought on it is that certainly all through my growing up, yeah, Birmingham City have been regarded within the city itself as a club who, if they do well, could potentially rival Villa for support. I think East Birmingham, which is the area that they look towards and the area between Birmingham and Solihull, not particularly affluent. There's a huge South Asian diaspora living there. I think many second and third generation South Asians tend to support Manchester United and Liverpool. I think historically, for whatever reason, but probably including hooliganism, they didn't find St Andrews or indeed many of the other local grounds very enticing to them. But there is actually a huge hinterland of people there who don't actually currently go to watch professional football. So I think the signs could be good for them. It's just that gap, isn't it, between where you are now, and I'd say they are regularly selling out 27,000. The gap between where they are now, it is such a big leap, isn't it, to 62,000. But they'll market it, they'll go at it hard. I wouldn't write them off.
No, I'm definitely not writing them off, and I
Mm.
think you're right in saying that there's also a hint of the City Football Group deal that Man City did made with the City of Manchester, where effectively you work with public money to regenerate an area of the city. And you end up effectively, whatever you lose on the football side, you make back on the property side. So I don't know the detail of how that partnership's working. And from a Knighthead perspective, if they've managed to maneuver it like City did, so that effectively their real estate projects pay for the football side and more, then hats off to them, because that really is, a wonderful trick to pull off and a very clever financing trick to pull off. You end up with an asset at the end of it, a football asset at the end of it, it's worth whatever it might be, a lot of money, and having not actually had to necessarily, in net terms, not have to spend all that money yourself. So I think it's going to be interesting. I do think that they are ahead of the game in understanding that stadium capacity is very important. And I think what we're going to probably see over the next 20 years, 30 years is some clubs having to come to grips with the fact that they're going to have to redevelop their grounds, particularly if TV revenues come under pressure. There are just too many sold out stadiums for it to make any financial sense. Even if over the course of the season, you're basically locking out, let's say, over the course of the entire season, 50,000 fans who are paying on average 20 quid a ticket. That's 10 million quid of sorry, how much is it? Bleary eyed. That is a very large sum of money. That is a very large sum of money to be locking out for clubs where revenue really is everything. So it's going to be interesting. I have to say, from a look and feel perspective, it does look quite extraordinary. It looks like something out of my 5-year-old daughter's sort of, picture books. It's sort of Brothers Grimm or sort of some sort of dystopian industrial, I think that's sort of, Gerald Scarfe style cartoon or something like this. The whole thing is quite extraordinary to look at. But one thing I will say is, it also, just relating to German football as well, is looking on the inside of it, it's going to be built very, very steep, like a proper football stadium, like White Hart Lane is as well. And that does seem to be a very encouraging modern trend. There was a rather grim period 20 years ago when football stadiums were being built in quite sort of bowl-like ways, almost like there could be any sport. It could be even, just a general venue. Whereas it does seem, at least we're now getting back to four stands, nice and steep. And even if you do have the corners filled in, it's not a uniform, just sort of, well, everything's exactly the same. So, good for them. I'm going to keep an eye on it, obviously, like we all do, and see see their progress. I guess they probably, to make it work, they're going to need to get to the Premier League, aren't they?
Oh
And
God,
that
yes.
is
Yeah, and that
and that is
that is not a given. And shortly after this podcast is published, they take on the mighty West Bromwich Albion at the Hawthorn. So
which will
yeah.
also not be a given.
I think they'll be expecting to get 3 points, truthfully. Anyway, before we go, Charlie, let's have a quick brief word then, because we've touched on this in the past, but there are changes now in the Premier League's financial rules. They're going to introduce the squad cost ratio system. And this is slightly different to profit and sustainability rules. Profit and sustainability rules were, as people remember, initially anyway, that you could lose £105 million over 3 seasons, and clubs like Nottingham Forest and Everton fell foul of that. But they're replacing profit and sustainability rules with squad cost ratios, which are, I guess, just more closely aligned to their real income.
So there have been two different ways of so-called controlling costs over the last 10 years. One of those is profit and sustainability rules, hilariously mistitled, as we often said before, because basically what they say is you are allowed to lose a certain amount of money. Right. So this has been what the Premier League and the Championship have been operating on for some time now. And at Premier League level, you've been able to lose basically 100 million quid over a 3-year rolling period. So 30 to 35 million quid a year on average has been the maximum that you are allowed to lose. Well, it's quite a large sum of money in terms of, what you're losing every single year. And at Championship level, obviously it's been much less than that, but about 35 million over a rolling 3-year period. Now, these rules obviously are not actually sustainable. Well, the rules themselves are sustainable, but the spending implied is not sustainable. It means that a club owner is basically just pouring money into a black hole endlessly. And we've seen the results of that and covered the results of that on this program and indeed in your book. So gradually, and particularly with the advent of the regulator and together with UEFA, introducing this other way of measuring things, which is revenue percentage based rules, where you're told, right, you take your revenue and we're going to only allow you to spend a certain percentage of that revenue on your first team. That first team, including transfer fees, including the amount you pay your manager, all this kind of stuff, all goes into this pot, and that's the maximum you're allowed to pay. Now, in Spain, they take it as far as basically telling the clubs in advance of a season, this is the amount, this is what you're allowed to spend. And I wonder if we're going to end up pretty much there, rather than in English football, we always do it retrospectively, which effectively allows people to break the rules and then get punished. Whereas in Spain, they get ahead of the problem and tell clubs exactly what their spending limit is, but much more sensible. So UEFA introduced these percentage-based rules to all clubs operating in European football. And of course, that means also clubs who aspire to being in European football have to be mindful of those, because if they do qualify for Europe, then they need to make sure that they can fit within those rules. So that's basically about 10 clubs in the Premier League have been on these SCRs from UEFA, which are 70%. So now the question came is, well, what's going to happen to the other 10 clubs in the Premier League? And some of those clubs were fighting against this on the basis that it would constrain their ability to, in quotation marks, compete, which is always something which I kick against and don't agree with and believe in, but nonetheless, that's what they said. And a number of those clubs wanted to keep on the old profit and sustainability rules, allowing them to lose lots of money every year, the privilege of losing lots of money. They wanted to keep that privilege of losing lots of money every year. but it got voted the other way. So they are now going on to a percentage-based system at 85%. Now, if you just take, for instance, a Premier League club with revenues of about 200 million. So this is about sort of the average of the mid division. What that means is that they're going to be able to spend 170 million quid on their first team as a whole, which will then give them 30 million quid to run the rest of their club, which is about right. That's about what it would cost to run the rest of a proper football club. Your academy is going to cost you 5 million, running your stadium, utilities, and all that other stuff. About 30 million should do it. So I'm all for it. I'm really happy. And what I hope now is that the Championship will move on to a similar system or be forced to by the regulator over the next few years.
And serious overspending under the I'll say it again, serious underspending under the squad cost ratio could see you having points deducted, but that is kind of very much down the line after financial sanctions and so on. But the option is there as it was under profit and sustainability rules. Charlie, thank you as always. I'll be back in Blighty very shortly and look forward to chatting again next week. Before we go, just to say thank you to Jed Thomas for his production assistance with this episode. And thanks also to Mark Machado at 11:29 and Football Smash for running our socials. Before we go, just a reminder that my book, Where's the Money Gone? The Battle for the Soul of English Football, is available now via Byline Books, the essential Christmas gift. Great to speak to you, Charlie. Stay well. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian.